But to tonight's presentation, Dr. Getzin has been in Namibia. He came first 1996, almost by accident, and he has been in the country for over 20 years, or doing the research on fairy circles for over 20 years now. And now he's written so many papers that we decided, okay, now he needs to present this to the public, because this is the not termite theory on the fairy circles. And he's been working with Gobabeb and other various institutions, as well as with UNAM. But before I now tell everything, I think you should rather tell it yourself.
Welcome to my talk on the fairy circuits. So actually, I've been working on this topic since the year 2000. You see here on the left one of these images I took in 2000. And so I'm really glad to talk tonight to you, because you are the locals and you are most interested in the fairy circuits. And I think it's time now to give an overview of what I've done in the past. And the title of the talk is actually going back to a brand new study which was published here in the year 2022 in October. And this goes back to a 3-year-long project which was funded by the German Research Foundation, where we looked specifically at the grass plants and how they react to rainfall, and in all these fairy circle landscapes in the Namib. And yeah, it was in the media, it was in the Namibian, and also in the other major media such as New York Times or Washington Post. Now, all this work goes not only back to myself, but I have a lot of collaborators and research partners. So these two here, Thorsten and Kerstin Wiegand, are from the University of Göttingen. Then the lower two here, Professor Meron and Hesi Yitzhak, are from Israel. They are the modeling persons. And then I have partners in Australia, these two, and Sönke Holsch was my bachelor student in 2021 and 2022. And Aili from Gobabeb also joined our fieldwork in the Kiribati area. And I've also written jointly papers with Walter Chinke, who is an entomology professor in the US, and with Mike Kramer. Yeah, and I always get support from Gobabeb, Gillian Max, and with Eugene Marais. So these are my partners, and they have also inspired my work. Just some facts about me. I studied at UNAM from 1997 to 2000. And I actually did a work about grazing dynamics in the Danviyun Park, which was later published in that journal. And I did voluntary work with IRDNC. So it's a nature community-based natural resources management project in the Northwest. And so I was based in Barrett's End in my study holidays. And we did, for example, these boundary negotiations for the Marienfluss Conservancy in 1999 with John Casaona here is. And this is also the area which has a lot of fairy circuits, like the Kiribati area or Marienfluss. And this is how I got to know the fairy circuits of Namibia. I then did my master's at the University of Potsdam. The topic was structural fire effects in savannas. And my PhD I did on spatial ecology, spatial statistics. So this is when you look perpendicularly from the bird eye's view down on the distribution of plants, trees, or animals. This is where I specialized in. Some facts about my fairy circle research. So in 2000, we wrote the first paper on fairy circuits, which used the term fairy circuits as such. And if you search in the Web of Science, which stores all the published papers, scientific papers, peer-reviewed papers, then if you enter the search topic fairy circuits, you will come to this paper. So it's one of the very early studies. In 2014, we discovered the fairy circuits in Australia, which is an identical sister pattern in the remote outback. And this study is also the most cited paper on fairy circuits in the Web of Science. So of these 72 publications, it made really big impact because here we compared the same phenomenon in Namibia and in Australia. Yeah, I've written 13 papers on the ferry circuits in total, quite a lot. So I think I can present you a lot of content in this evening. And I do a lot of field work since 2015. I'm every year in the Namib, and I drive up and down the Namib from the Orange River to the Kunene and look how the ferry circuits change or how grasses respond. So we have a lot of monitoring sites which we visit repeatedly, like in the Kiribati Plains or at Namib Rand. So I've driven a lot of kilometers in this past years, and I did a lot of field work. And back home then, of course, you do nowadays as an ecologist, you do a lot of computer work as well. If we go to this Web of Science, which stores all the scientific articles or journals, then we can see here the development in terms of number of publications on ferry circuits. And here's our 2000 paper, that's the first one. And then for the first 10 years, there was not so much interest. There was only every 2 or 3 years, one single paper. And then suddenly 2015, 16, 17, we had a sharp rise in the interest. And so this topic is really hot and many people are interested in the ferry circuits. Now, these are these are the studies which deal with most hypotheses. And one point why the ferry circuits are so confusing is that many researchers find a certain correlating agent. Like, for example, Naudi et al., they found abiotic gas in the ferry circuits. And from that correlation, they constructed a theory that gas should cause the ferry circuits. Mike Picker, he found ants in all the ferry circuits, and he said in 2012, the ants must be causing it. Then we have the sand termites correlating, harvester termites, even burrowing rodents have been proposed as a causal agent, euphorbias, microbes, and so on. So there is a lot of correlation, but the question is really what is causing the ferry circuits. And what we do is we have like a holistic approach. We mainly ask which mechanism can explain all the characteristics that you observe in the ferry circuits. And one primary step is so-called pattern process inference. So we describe very much in detail the patterns of the ferry circuits, and then we ask which proposed causal agent is actually able to create the same pattern. We do a lot of process-based modeling, mainly with the Israeli colleagues, and then we fit the models to real-world observations. We test processes in the field. We do manipulations. That's here Australia, but we also do it here at Namib Rand, or have done it. We do soil excavations, and we also look at the boundary conditions just to see how ferry circuits change in very different environments. Like here, these are the Kiribati Plains. Here you have elongated ferry circuits that are 35 meters long and 7 meters wide. So we are interested, why do these circuits behave now so strangely at these boundary conditions? Yeah, just generally, ferry circuits in Namibia occur mainly between 70 and 120 millimeter rainfall, and they disappear in the east at about 150 millimeter rainfall. And this is a area shot from the, or satellite image from the Kiribati area. Here you see 10,000s of ferry circuits, and they all have the same pattern. Now in this talk, I want to give you an historic overview, and also I want to discuss the 3 main hypotheses. By the way, my talk is relatively long. I apologize already. Like 70 minutes from now. I hope I will not bore you, but it's such a complex topic, so it may take a bit longer. So the Euphorbia hypothesis was big in the media like two years ago. Let's look at the Euphorbia hypothesis. This is actually the first real study on ferry circuits, which was undertaken in 1978 by Theron. So it's that study here, published in 1979. So he did actually a very clever job. He marked ferry circuits with a metal rod. And he also marked decaying, rottening, dead, dying Euphorbia shrubs. And he proposed that the death of the Euphorbia leaves could poison the soil and form fairy circuits. And this Euphorbia hypothesis was reactivated in 2015 by Marion Meyer et al., who found a strong link between fairy circuits and Euphorbias at Garup, south of the train station, south of the railway line. And then in 2020, he wrote this paper here, and maybe you remember that one. So he said all the fairy circuits are caused by Euphorbias. And we highly questioned that, and we actually did field work and studies on that to test that hypothesis. And there's actually 4 reasons why we can reject the Euphorbia hypothesis. So first of all, here you see the metal rods in the southern Kiribati area. This is a plot here. And here you see a mark, dead Euphorbia from more than 40 years ago. Here you see a marked fairy circle. And actually none of the Euphorbias that he marked transformed into a fairy circle. So you can test that with Google Earth imagery or with drone imagery, which we did. So none of the circuits transformed into, none of the Euphorbias transformed into a circle. And the main point is grass growth is generally not inhibited under these decaying Euphorbia shrubs, which you see here. These are all grass tussocks, and they just grow there and are not hampered or poisoned by any substrate. The same is true at Brandberg. Here, the left image. This is a dead Euphorbia damarana, and you see a lot of grass growth. And here on the right side, these are all examples from Garup 2021. And also here you see everywhere are the grasses, and they just don't care about the Euphorbia leaves. The second reason is why we can reject that hypothesis is if you want to compare the size distribution of fairy circuits and Euphorbias, you can only take the dead ones, because the hypothesis is that dead Euphorbias, like you see here, are causing the circuits. So you cannot take the small alive ones. This is not valid. So what we found in this original plot of the run in the southern Kiribati is that you have extremely large fairy circuits, which are these ones here, 13 to 19 meter in diameter. Here's an example. But the largest Euphorbias we found reached only 12 meters, so they cannot explain these huge fairy circuits. On the contrary, at Brandberg, which are the lower 2 right images here, we found fairy circuits that have just a diameter of 2 meters, very small, 2 to 3 meters, but the largest dead Euphorbias, or the smallest dead Euphorbias that we found, were 4 to 7 meter in diameter. So these dead shrubs cannot explain these small fairy circuits. Third reason, so Meyer et al. Claimed that hydrophobic properties would cause a faster water infiltration. And he actually did 3 measurements from 3 regions, but he analyzed it in a laboratory. Now, we actually did a test with mini disc infiltrometer and looked if there's any faster soil water infiltration in the circle than outside in the matrix. And we did this in 10 regions from Garup over Namib Rand up to Marienfluss and Hartmann's Valley. And the result is there is definitely no systematic difference or systematic faster infiltration in the fairy circuits than outside. Sometimes you have faster infiltration in the circle, sometimes faster infiltration outside. So it cannot generally explain why the grasses are desiccating and dying in the circuits. And the fourth reason is the spatial patterns. So these are here fairy circle patterns, and these are the Euphorbias in the same study plot. And basically in 4 out of 5 study plots, we found that the Euphorbias, the patterns of the Euphorbias differed significantly from the fairy circles. And most Euphorbias were clustered. so aggregated, and the fairy circuits were regularly distributed. So the process that causes the fairy circuits cannot be euphorbias, because they just have a different distribution pattern, different dispersal modes, and so on. And that's why we wrote this paper in response to Meyer et al. And we can really say this is not true. Moreover, at Namib Rand, you have, like Wolvedans, Jakob area, you have thousands of fairy circuits and no euphorbia. So how can you explain that? The termite hypothesis is the second one we want to discuss here. So this goes actually back to Tinley, 1971. So he said here that the circular bare patches are probably fossil termitaria. And this refers to an image in the Marienfluss Valley. But there was no data collected in support. So it was just gut feeling. Then in 1994, Eugene Moll did a more thorough analysis of all the fairy circuits, actually in all the typical fairy circle regions of the Namib. And then he proposed the harvester termite hypothesis. But he said he didn't find Hodotermis mozambicus, he didn't find the harvester termite, but nevertheless, he said it could be responsible for the formation of the fairy rings. So again, there was no data collected in support of these termite hypothesis. And those of you who remember the 1990s, maybe you will remember that the common sense was harvester termites are creating the fairy circuits, but it was not based on data. So the termite hypothesis is so popular because it's so easy to explain. You just say the grasses have eaten a hole into the grass layer and that's it. But that's not based on data for more than almost 30 years. So only in the year 2000, we actually found then harvester termites clipping off the leaves and bringing the leaf material to the foraging holes that was in the Marienfluss area. And we also saw that Osimyrmex carnivorous ants have eaten away or preyed on the termites, which suffer under thermal distress at about 40, 41 degrees. So they die. And we saw all the ants preying on these termites and killed them. And we thought maybe this is the reason why you don't find termites in the circuits. Maybe it's due to these carnivorous ants. But there was not much known in 2000, so there was not really a big databases that we have nowadays about fairy circuits. And in the year 2012-13, I changed my mind, and because based on pattern analysis, it cannot be the termites. Then in 2013, the Sen termite hypothesis was published by Norbert Jürgens. So he claimed that the fairy circuits are a termite-generated ecosystem. So the generation of a perennial water supply facilitates the survival of termites, even in the extreme drought years. So the idea was that they would engineer permanent water reservoirs to utilize it in the dry season. And the mechanism which he proposed was foraging on roots of freshly germinated grasses, and which would kill them, and this causes the bare patch. And then he made an astonishing statement: in 80 to 100% of the fairy circuits, then termite nests in underground tunnel-like galleries were found a few decimeters below the surface until a few centimeters. So the question is, why has nobody seen this before, if it's so obvious? And we then had in 2015, the first fairy circle symposium at Wolvedans, and this was hosted by late Albi Brückner. Stephan is here, he was also there. And this was organized by Niels Odendahl, who is sitting here. And in that room were all the termite and Euphorbia and gas and plant self-organization researchers. So we had all different opinions, but to be honest, none of the person in the room agreed with the Sen termite hypothesis. We had all conflicts, and but yeah, that's written in the Namibian. The Fairy Circle Symposium leaves the mystery unanswered. Here we see Eugene Moll, Karl Albrecht, William Lankowitz, that's Mike Kramer, Walter Chinke, and so on. It was quite a nice experience, that conference. Unfortunately, there was no follow-up conference so far, but maybe we could have one in the near future. Yeah, so I gave a talk on that conference about the spatial patterns. And we published in 2014 this paper here. It only got page numbers in 2015, but it was out in 2014 already, where we tested the termite hypothesis, the gas hypothesis, and the plant self-organization hypothesis based on the spatial patterns of the objects. And we did also a follow-up paper where we explain very much in detail on 2 pages how the fairy circuits differ from termite patterns. And we even did a big meta-analysis in 2019, which was published together with Mike Kramer and Walter Chinke. Now, I don't want to go into detail here. Maybe I should not explain this function. What is typical for the termite pattern, for the fairy circle pattern, is that they are characterized by 6 nearest nearest neighbors, and the distances between these 6 nearest neighbors are approximately the same. And this creates like a grid-like pattern, so a highly regular pattern. And this here is a neighborhood density function that looks at it counts the number of fairy circles at a certain distance. And here at a distance of about 15 meters, it detects all the 6 nearest neighbors. And that's why the density is very high and shoots up. And then behind that first row, it doesn't detect any circles. And it's significantly regular again. And so this is a signature of the fairy circle pattern. It's a spatially periodic pattern, which is a regular pattern, but it differs from a regular pattern by having an extraordinary degree of spatial ordering. And if you look at typical macrothermis mound patterns here from Ochu, they never attain this strong periodicity in the pattern. They don't have this strong peak and not this second negative peak below the confidence envelopes. And it's not just the macrothermis termites which cannot produce this pattern. It's basically all the termite and ant patterns from arid environments that are similar or comparable to the fairy circles. So we look, for example, at ants and termites in Australia, harvester ants in Arizona. They do disc clearing in the US. We looked at termites in Namibia, South Africa, Kenya, Brazil, Mozambique. And none of these dryland examples shows that termites could create the pattern of the fairy circles. And here's another statistic on the left. It's based on nearest neighbors, but it shows actually the same. You have the fairy circles from Australia and Namibia. It's a highly clustered location, which is highly ordered in the upper right corner of that plot. And then you have the next ordered termite and ant patterns. And there's a huge gap between the two. So the termite and ants from these dryland examples cannot really explain the pattern of the fairy circuits, which is so strongly regular. And also there is this paper on the harvester termites in southern Angola, or the most northern tip of the Namib. This is another example for the low ordering of these termite patterns in a similar dry and water limited environment. Also, these neighborhood density functions here show merely a regular pattern, but not a spatially periodic patterns. And these regular patterns are very common worldwide. And they also differ from fairy circles in that they have a central nest in the circle and they do central place foraging. You don't have this with fairy circles. And that's why we classified also these harvester termites from Angola as just common vegetation gaps that are very abundant worldwide. And we have published here like 3 major differences between common vegetation gaps and the circles in this paper here, which is open access. Everybody can download it. Yeah, the second reason why we think that the sand termite hypothesis is not true is because simply most people don't find these termites. And in the definition paper, we cited 10 different sources who said we didn't find these termites. I just give you 3 examples here. So Van Rooyen et al., they excavated virtually everywhere where you have fairy circuits in Namibia, excavated very thoroughly the fairy circuits, even up to 2.2 meter depths. They emphasized that they did it very carefully. But they say none of the trenches revealed any termite tunnels, and the presence of termite nests beneath the circle is yet to be demonstrated. Same was found by Dr. Getzin here, who is a well-known entomologist from the US, and he's particularly known for his ability to excavate termite and ant nests. Here is his Wikipedia webpage with an excavated structure of ants. And he was initially thinking that the fairy circles would be termite caused, but he stated in 2014, that it took him about 3 days to establish with no doubt that this has absolutely nothing to do with termites. And this conclusion was based on his work. He was the first entomologist who used a leaf blower, which you can see here. With a leaf blower, you can really reveal all the fine tunnel structures, which you see down here. And he did a big excavation job here at Namib Run. And yeah, he stated clearly that he found no termites, no association between termites and fairy circuits. And that's just a fact, you know, the absence of these termites is just a fact. And the same is true for the work of Eugene Marais, who worked together with Ravi et al. For this paper in 2017. So when the science paper in 2013 came out, he was specifically looking at sand termites in several regions of Namibia. But he clearly stated that he didn't find the presence of termites, sand termites, as suggested by Jürgens. And the absence of these termites can also not be excused. Now you hear, okay, it was dry season. The termites maybe have not been there. But this, it cannot be an excuse for the absence of termites, because if the idea is ecosystem engineering, that they utilize the fairy circuits in the dry season because they store moisture, then they should be found also in the dry season, because in the wet season, in the rainy season, all the insects have big breakouts, you know, the locusts, the dickpens, termites, and so on. Yeah, and he stated, at present, empirical data on termite tunnel structures within fairy circuits that may favor niche construction by sand termites are not yet available. And I was not surprised that we found in the past 3 years no termite evidence when we excavated all these grasses. Sorry, more text to you. All right. Okay, thank you. Now you can hear me back, I hope. So this, what I show now is for the past 3 years, we looked at how the grasses die. If you go immediately after rainfall, you go to the fairy circuits and you check how these fairy circuits die. And this was our reference here. So in 2013, Jürgens showed in the appendix, so figure S9A in the appendix, not in the main article, he showed this single anecdotal image. And what you see here is some 2 dead grasses. They are yellow and have no roots. And we see 3 green grasses, which have long roots and partly have shorter roots. But what does it really mean? Can we really generalize from this And that's why we did a systematic survey, and we did the same as Jürgen's. And you don't need a magnifying glass or microscope to see root herbivory. So we took the same images in various regions of the Namib. So for example, this is Namib Brand here. This is a dead grass from the fairy circle. The root is very long and undamaged. It even has a complete rhizosheath, the sand coating around. This is Garup. Here we have Brandberg, the upper image, the upper grass here. The green one is from the matrix outside, and the dead one, the yellow one, is from within the circle. And this is also Brandberg here. This grass is from within the circle, and this grass here is from outside. And we see, and this is also more Brandberg examples here. And we see that the roots are visually indistinguishable between the dead grasses in the circle and the alive grasses outside. We also, and we documented this also on YouTube. So you can click on YouTube on that video and see how we live excavated these grasses. That is even true for new appearing fairy circuits. So these are drone images from 2021 at Namib Brand. This is from 2020 at Namib Brand, and this is an old Google Earth picture. I don't know if the projector really shows it. No, it doesn't show it. But the arrows are pointing to new fairy circuits. So we specifically marked these in a GPS, and we went to these new appearing fairy circuits and then checked the death of the grasses. And so this is actually also valid for new appearing circuits, not just for the maintenance of mature established fairy circuits. And this here is also a very interesting site. It's near the Kamberg, so that's 20 kilometers southwest of Rostock-Ritz towards the Kulsep in the Naukluft Park. Far East dunes are not far away from that spot. And here we were lucky in 2020. It was a poor rainfall season, as you know. We found a green patch here. And this is the image is taken here 8 to 9 days after rainfall. There was one big rainfall event, and 8 to 9 days after rainfall already, the grasses were dying. These are the images E, F, and G. And then we came back after 20 days, after 3 weeks, then all the grasses were completely dead. But as you can see here on the roots, they have pretty long roots, but no damage at all. So the death of these grasses was certainly not any termite herbivory. And in our excavations, we also checked always for the presence of termites, and we just didn't find any early after rainfall in that area. And this image here shows exactly the same fairy circuits that we visited in 2020, but in 2022, the rain season was much better. The grasses were much taller, as you can see here. And again, we excavated these grasses, and these lower yellow ones here are the grasses from within the circle, and the green ones are from outside. And you clearly see that the roots have not been chewed away by any termites, even after a strong rainfall season. So our data are also robust in a temporal sense. Now, this table shows the 4 main study regions: Kamberg, Jakob, Garup, and Brandberg. And here is the number of days after triggering rainfall. And if the triggering rainfall was very recently, like 3 weeks away, or here 35 days, this is a fairy circle, this is a matrix, excavated grasses. Then we found in 100% of the excavated grasses, there was no termite damage, no root damage, no herbivory. And at Brandberg, it was the same. Only later, like in these plots here, 7 to 8 weeks after rainfall, 18 to 32% of all the dead grasses showed signs of root damage. So then you see the chewed away root parts. So termites prefer to feed on dead plant material because all these grasses were dead long ago. And our results are actually supported by 3 papers on Psammotermis So termites are actually known as detritus feeders, which can explain that we find an increase in root damage long after rainfall when the grasses were long dead. And so termites or sand termites were classified as wood and litter feeder by Zeitler or as detritus feeder by Crawford and Seeley. And very interestingly, Jacobson et al., they looked in the very arid part of the Namib, how psammothermous sand termites affect the grasses. And they clearly, clearly stated that they selectively grazes the outer gray layer of the stems. So not the alive stuff, but the detritus. So this image here is showing it. And this is even is even true for Stipagostis ciliata, the grass species, which makes the fairy circuits in the Namib. Quickly, some water. Yeah, back to this table. So what we found, this is a median root length of dead grasses within the circle and of dead or alive grasses in the matrix. In this plot, they were exactly equal. In the Brandberg area, we had even significantly longer roots in the fairy circles. And these are the root to shoot ratios. They were in both cases significantly larger. So these grasses invest biomass and resources into the growth of roots rather than into shoots, because they were desiccating, they were wilting, they were trying to tap water, which is in deeper layers. That's why they have pretty long roots shortly after rainfall. And of course, if root herbivory would be the cause of the death of these grasses, you cannot have the same root length, and you can by no means have longer roots in the circle than outside. And when our paper came out, the New York Times interviewed a couple of fairy circle researchers, like these two here, Marion Meyer and Yvette Naudet. They have no relation to our hypothesis. They follow an own hypothesis, but they all agreed that our evidence, systematic evidence from several regions of the Namib can reject the termite hypothesis, at least for what we have documented in these 3 or 4 regions over 3 years. So Yvette Naudet said, contrary to popular belief, termite activity does not cause the fairy circles. Marion Meyer said the new study showed conclusively that termites were not a factor, and Walter Chinke said the support for the hydrodynamic explanation is now very strong, and the support for the termite cause is very weak. And this is how science works. You generate new data, and scientific progress is always based on new data, always on, in support of new data. Again, did you hear me what I said? Okay. Somehow I play with this thing. I don't know, actually I do nothing. Okay. This was everything about the Euphorbia hypothesis and the history and the termite hypothesis. Now, in the last part, I want to explain to you what we favor. We call it the most plausible working hypothesis, because we don't think that science is always, science is not endless, or how we don't think that this is necessarily the final solution, but all the evidence is in support for the plant self-organization hypothesis. Plant self-organization is not so well known among ecologists and people, because it happens in very harsh environments, in very remote areas, like in the Sahel zone in Niger or Sudan, or in the remote outback of Australia. So these are areas where people don't live and scientists don't want to work there. Sometimes it's really not accessible. And this is where you see plant self-organization patterns like those ones here. And another reason is why it's not so popular. You only see it from the bird's eye view, from the top, from aerial imagery. If you would walk here through these tribes, you would not see that this is a pattern. This is the other reason why it's not so well known. Overall, so here we see a graph. This is continuous vegetation, the black color. This is naked bare soil desert. And in between, we can have different types of patterns. We can have gap patterns like here. We can have stripe patterns like here, or spot vegetation like here. And then there comes bare soil desert. And these patterns are spatially periodic, so you have always a repetition in the bare soil. And this is actually just reflecting the scale of water shortage in the landscape. That's why you have homogeneously everywhere the same patterns. And another reason which favors these patterns is these arid environments are so species poor, they are just dominated by one or two plant species. Like here we have Stipagrostis, mainly 2 species in the Namib, depending on where you are. And shrub species are also very limited in the number of species in those areas. Here I just show you some examples of self-organized vegetation. These are festuca grasses in the dry Andes in South America. And the interesting thing here is it's a grass which has a high phenotypic plasticity. So on a slope, it forms barriers to block the water which flows down. But on level terrain, in the flat area, it creates large circles or rings, because here the competition for water is very symmetrical. You also have well-known self-organized patterns here in Namibia. This is here Salsola and Melobium bushes on a slope 40 kilometers west of Maltahöhe. The same you have near Bullsport, the same pattern on a gentle slope. And these shrubs are just catching the water. The best examples you get actually in the outback of Australia. This is a tree stripe pattern on a slope. So the water flows down here. And these are the Australian fairy circles, which are found here on the horizon, just 10 kilometers away. So the same aridity stress is in this system, the same climate. And as I said, the consistent spacing of this bare soil is due to a homogeneous lack of water in the entire system. Just want to explain quickly how self-organization works. So you need, in this case, you always need 50 meters of bare soil. These are clay crust, and when it rains, you have a lot of runoff and it flows towards the vegetation stripe. So you have, at a small scale, you have a so-called positive feedback loop, which is caused by an infiltration feedback. So you have here enhanced water infiltration because the roots are loosening the soil crust. And then you have falling leaves or branches. They fall to the ground. They block the water which comes from the top. So you have more water. And also the recroids, the small seedlings, are facilitated in the shade. And this is like a self-enhancing, small-scale positive feedback loop. And at the same time, these plants are stealing water from the lower parts here. Now imagine, make a mental experiment. Replace these alive trees with wooden poles, which are dead. You just hammer in a row of wooden poles here, they would do nothing. You would find the next line of trees just next to the wooden poles because they are not actively stealing the water. But these self-enhancing positive small-scale feedback loops are actually stealing the water from their neighbors. And this leads to a large-scale negative feedback effect in bare soil. So the plants are actually redistributing the soil water. They do it actively, and thereby they modify the abiotic environment with their barriers. And plants act in the same way like the beaver. Plants act as ecosystem engineers because the beaver is also just building barriers and redistributing the water. Wieder weg. Aber ich mache nichts, wirklich. Hört ihr mich? Ja. Komisch. Bin nicht rangegangen. Yeah, and that was published already in 2004 that plants are ecosystem engineers. Just some background information. We can have 3 different types of feedback effects. So these are biomass water feedbacks, and that depends on the prevalent soil type and the plant architecture, which type of feedback you have. Like in Australia, on clay crusts, you have the infiltration feedback. So the water infiltrates easily where the roots are loosening the soil. In Namibia, here with coarse, porous sands, you have more the uptake diffusion feedback, or the soil water diffusion feedback, which means the grasses, for example, they transpire a lot of moisture. They cannot control the moisture. They transpire and transpire under the heat, and then they suck the water laterally by soil water diffusion towards their roots. And so these are the main principles of the biomass water feedbacks. In Namibia, you have actually many plant species which form rings. And this is a new project which is sponsored by the German Research Foundation. It just started now in February, where we look at those plant rings in the Namib. We found in the last 2 years, 12 different plant species, all making rings. And this includes also Schmittia kalahariensis. It's an annual grass, and they make perfect circles up to 1 meter in diameter. That's here at Donkerhoek. We discovered that accidentally, actually. But it's so obvious. After rainfall, these grasses pop up. They have like fairy circle, a very large periphery. So they have a lot of biomass. And we did measurements of soil moisture in the rings and outside. And you see that in the rings, the soil moisture was much lower. And the grasses are actually sucking out the water from the circle. And the same you find at Namib with annual forbs of the genus Limeum. They also make a lot of circles and coexist with fairy circles in the same area, near Toktoki area, family hideout, southern Namib. Yeah, and our question is, how do they do it? And this is part of this new project, which will last now for the next 3 years. And here on top, you have a typical Hypacostis fairy circle, which becomes a gap, a vegetation gap, not a ring in the rainy season when the surrounding is covered by grass. And the reason why they form a ring or a circle is actually very logic, because a circle has always the smallest circumference to area ratio. Now these areas here, the fairy circles, they store water. And if you make a circle, then least plants need to share this limited water together. If the shape would be a square or a highly lobed structure, then the circumference would be much larger relative to the available water. And that's why these grasses are making a circle, because they maximize their access to this limited water, and they are also in competitive balance. So they outcompete any neighbor who wants to germinate in the circle. Now, this slide I just show to say there is a wealth of studies, even on Namibian fairy circles, that all support the plant self-organization hypothesis. It was first mentioned 19 years ago by Van Rooyen et al., who dedicated a whole chapter on plant self-organization. There is a lot of fieldwork studies by Walter Chinke, Mike Kramer, Sujit Ravi, which have concluded that fairy circles should be self-organized based on hydrological measurements and so on. So there is quite a big body of literature and studies which supports the self-organization hypothesis. For example, Mike Kramer, he used stable isotope labeling of water, so radioactive labeling of water at Namib, and he has shown that water moves horizontally over 7.5 meters within a short time period of 1 to 3 weeks. So the water in the sands of Namib moves laterally, horizontally. And these are facts published in this paper based on radioactive labeling. And this also explains why you often find these halos around the fairy circles, because in a desert, biomass equals water. And these halos, which can be 9 meters long or 8 meters, they just reflect that at the end here, there's not enough water. They don't get enough water from the circle anymore. And that's why you have these bare soil patches at the distances furthest away from the circles. Now let's come to our own results from the past 3 years. So we planted soil moisture sensors at 20 centimeter depths at Namib Jakob Mountain, which is one of the prime study sites for doing research on fairy circles. And we installed them in the circle, then at the periphery, then in the matrix, and again in the circle. And actually we were very lucky because in 2020, there was a long drought at Namib and there was no grass cover at all, as you can see here. And we were wondering what will happen if all the grasses come out and they transpire and they draw water by diffusion. What will happen to the soil moisture measurements? And here we see that we download the data loggers, the data from the loggers in 2021. And we did the same in 2022. Now I show results here for 2022 because they are most clear. So we have here one grass triggering rainfall event in January. And then we compare 1 week after the first rainfall event to 2 weeks after rainfall event. And the question is, how does the soil moisture change? And we see without grasses, so early in the growth season, without grasses, the drop of soil moisture within the fairy circle and in the matrix is basically the same, minus 1.4, minus 1.3. There's no grasses yet. And then we look at the second major rainfall event here. And again, we look 1 week after the second major rainfall event, and then 2 weeks after the major rainfall event. And what we see here is that now the drop in soil moisture from 2.8 to 8.9 is minus 3.8, and that is 2.7 times higher within the same week, dropping from the same level of 12.8 down. And we see also that the matrix grasses strongly depleted the soil moisture by minus 6. So we see the activity of the grasses, how they draw the water, how they utilize it. But the important thing here is that this drop with the grasses, with the matrix grasses outside, is 2.7 times higher than at the first instance when there was no grass vegetation at all. And this can only mean that these dense matrix grasses have strongly drawn the water from the fairy circle. I have to add and mention that the absolute soil moisture values at 20 centimeter depths may be higher in a fairy circle than outside because they are affected from the increasing moisture depths below 30 centimeter. But the large peripheral grasses and the matrix grasses, they induce this critical loss of fairy circle water. And this is actually outcompeting the grasses from within the circle, because we are still here in a system which is where the grasses are competing very strongly for water. And particularly the upper 10 centimeter of soil are crucial for plant survival and mortality, because this is where the young grasses are establishing. And we did not measure at 10 centimeter depths the soil moisture because we were afraid that zebras or oryx would dig out our sensors. But Jürgens has published data on this at 10 centimeter depths. And here we see that at 10 centimeter depths, the soil water inside the fairy circle is 2.9 millimeter, 5 days after a rainfall event, but 17.4 millimeter outside in the circle. So we see that the upper 10 centimeters even have in absolute terms or values less moisture. And also this study shows it here. This thick yellow line is the fairy circle. It has less moisture than the matrix outside the 10 centimeter depth. So these empirical data are actually supporting the fact that these grasses are dying of plant water stress, of desiccation and wilting. And this is the reason why they have so long roots, why they invest biomass into roots to tap the water, which they can't get in the upper 10 centimeter. And we are almost at the end. I think 2 more topics, then you are done. So another factor that clearly shows that fairy circuits are a water-driven phenomenon is if you compare the behavior of the fairy circuits from a dry season like here, Namib 2020 to 2021. So we mapped 3 25-hectare plots with a drone at Jakob. We do that every year. Also this year I will do it again, get a nice sequence over 6 years. And within these plots, we have varying amounts of fairy circuits, mature fairy circuits. So based on about 2,500 fairy circuits, we can make really good statistics. We can really say, how do the fairy circuits behave in response to rainfall? So we classified them either as being closed, which means more than, or at least 2/3 of the fairy circle area should be covered by grasses, or they can be completely dead, 100% coverage. And here you see how with a good rainfall season 2021, you see that the grasses are disappearing. And my bachelor student, Sönke Holl, she did his thesis about this analysis here. This table is from his bachelor thesis. And here we have the 3 plots, Yard 1, Yard 2, Yard 3. And we see that with a good rainfall year, 57% or 44% or 34% of all mature fairy circuits closed. So they were revegetating with grasses. And this happened here in 21 with 80 millimeter rainfall, which is double the long-term mean over the past 10 years. And new fairy circuits were very rare, just 9 in this plot, 0 in the second plot, and 6 in the third plot. So biomass water feedbacks and the availability of water is definitely the driver of the fairy circuits. And now comes my last slide, second last slide. You know that the fairy circuits disappear at 150 millimeter rainfall here in the east. So this is probably familiar to you. Here is Old Bethesda, Little Sossos is here, Bethesda Elegant Camp, and this is a D road through Namib Mountain Farm, which goes then to Sesrium or here to Namib Run. And this is a 100 millimeter rainfall ISO height. And the fairy, if you drive that way over Namib Mountain Farm, you see that the fairy circuits suddenly pop up here in this area. But you hardly see fairy circuits here at about 150 millimeter rainfall. And yeah, if we know that 10 or 12 millimeter rainfall in the Namib Desert is enough to create a green carpet of water, grass, sorry, then it's clear that if you switch from 130 or 140 millimeter mean annual precipitation to 150, that this water is enough to close the fairy circuits and to get a continuous vegetation cover at 150 millimeter rainfall. So this again is a completely water-driven phenomenon. And this is my really last slide. So concluding, you were brave, it's a long talk. Concluding remarks and take-home messages. So the timing of fieldwork is really critical because the grasses, they complete their life cycle within a very short time period in the Namib, just within 1 or 2 weeks. You have to be in time there and check how did these grasses die? Were there any termites present or not? And we show that the grasses died quickly and there was no termite herbivory present. We think that we need to study more the subtle degrees of water availability in how plants redistribute this scarce water via competition and self-organization. That's particularly relevant in very arid environments like the Namib. We can say plants are stupid. Yes, they don't have brains, but the spatial patterns that they develop to cope with water stress is finally intelligent, because it's the most intelligent way to utilize that limited water. Yeah, at the end, fairy circles are merely an expression that there's not enough water along the Namib to sustain a continuous vegetation layer. That's actually a very simple explanation. And with this, I would like to thank the Namibia Scientific Society for inviting me, the German Research Foundation, and then all the Namibian institutions and cooperation partners. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. I see everyone is still here and interested. For the sake of the people on Zoom, I ask that all questions be spoken into the mic. I will wander around and hand you the mic. So the floor is open.
Hi, Stephan. Thanks very much. That was very interesting. The question I have and what I'm struggling to understand is, and maybe you can just give a brief explanation. What I'm struggling to understand is the mechanism of how a fairy circle would start. I mean, I understand the end result is that there isn't enough water to have a continuous layer of the plants or the grasses. But I'm struggling to understand what mechanism would start the fairy circle, and does it start small and then the fairy circle get bigger and bigger? Or if you see a fairy circle that's like 8 meters in diameter, did the spatial arrangement of the grasses or the plants, did it start at the diameter that it ends at? Or how does the mechanism start that really is the driver of the first time that you see a fairy circle? How would you explain in mechanical terms how this works?
So there was one study by Zelnick et al. 2015, and they have actually compared a long sequence of rainfall data with a long sequence of satellite imagery. And they found that after cumulative dry years, you see more fairy circles popping up. In a rainfall event, it rains, yes, but it's a cumulative dry year. So aridity is definitely the driver why certain areas pop up with bare soil. And the areas which pop up with bare soil, they can start small. We have a definition for the smallest size of a fairy circle is 2 meters, not smaller, 2 meters. And they actually start growing at locations which are furthest away from surrounding fairy circles. And these are the areas which benefit least from water, which would surround them. And that's why it's just drying, it's a sort of a drying thing that these bare soil patches emerge after long, prolonged droughts. But then if it rains, you have these small-scale positive feedback loops which cause an instability. The grasses are aggregating biomass, and then, yeah, this is actually outcompeting then the neighbors. But the main driver is the aridity over consecutive years. So you have to have like 3-4 years with below average rainfall, and then just drought causes a circle. And the pattern is very stable actually over many, many years and decades. And we also observe, we have to distinguish between new fairy circles and so-called floaters in time, because you may have a new fairy circle at one location, but if you go to Google Earth, you will see it was there already 15 years ago, but not 5 years ago. So even the smaller ones, we call them floaters in time, they pop up at the same location. The location is always furthest away from the water sources of the fairy circuits. And just to add, I'm right now writing a paper where we look at the spatial pattern of the closing ones. And the closing fairy circuits are, what our analysis shows, are sort of aggregated. So those fairy circuits which close have more neighbors around them which also revegetate. So they are supplying each other with moisture. So it's a scale-dependent, landscape scale-dependent phenomenon. Yes? Where does fairy, dancing fairies come at night and they dance in a circle, and that's why they make it? If you ask the Himba people in the Marienfluss, they don't care actually. For them, it's always there. It's nothing special to them. It's, yeah. So, I mean, we have the fairy rings, you know, in Europe, which are caused by fungal mycelium. These are fairy rings. And there's actually the same background stories. Fairies come.
I noticed that in your last presentations, I think slides, it seems that when there is more rainfall, then the cycle disappear.
Yes.
Is there any chance that in one spot they disappeared total, maybe because the places are not receiving the same rainfall? Maybe one place has got more rainfall and then the cycle disappeared.
Yeah.
Did you find out in
You
one
mean,
case like that?
You mean this image here?
In the slides where you have two places. Which,
Okay. There was this one here.
Yeah, that one.
Yeah.
Where you found out that where there is the rainfall is more than 150 millimeters.
Yes. That's,
the cycle disappeared.
yes.
Did they disappear forever or they just disappeared because they are covered by the grass, and then after the dry season they appeared again?
Actually, at this rainfall ice ride, about 150, you don't find fairy circuits anymore. But it depends on where you are. You know, here are the mountains, and the mountains provide a sharp gradient in water availability. So you may find some fairy circuits here in specific years, yes, but the overall decline is at the 150 millimeter rainfall ISO height. And maybe if there is prolonged drought years, even at that 150 millimeter ISO height, you have more fairy circle likelihood. But otherwise, it's a continuous vegetation cover. The same is true if you go from Solitaire north. You look on the right side of the sea road to the grasses, it looks like this. You don't have fairy circuits there. It's too moist. Does that answer your question? Okay.
Manny Goldbeck.
Hello.
Hallo, Herr Getzin. I had the privilege to spend last week with Professor Jürgens in the Namib. And I told him, show me that you find certain termites here. And we did find them. He poured water the day before on a few of the survey circles. He saw evidence that there are certain termites. And then I actually saw one with my own eyes. And I brought you also a termite nest. It's in a red bag there on the left side. So, but I'm not here to argue now, but I just want to say I saw it, and I would give an arm and a leg to see the two scientists, you and Dr. Jürgens, in a podcast discussing the different theories, or even in a field to have a look that he maybe can prove to you that there are termites and you can prove him wrong.
Yeah.
But I would give an arm and a leg. But I've got also a question. You did look at the grasses and you saw no damage, the young grasses coming up. Did you also look at it under the microscope or just by eye evidence if there's any damage?
That's a new argument now from the supporters of the sand termite hypothesis. Now suddenly you need a microscope in order to see it. But before he published this picture, this one anecdotal picture of supposedly damaged roots, if root herbivory would exist, it's a reduction in biomass. It cannot explain the same length of the roots, and it can by no means explain having longer roots of dead grasses in the circuits. And you don't need a microscope for this. If you go to a hair cutter, you don't need a microscope to see the haircut afterwards. And you know, that's the new type of excuse which sounds desperate. We have shown that these grassroots are indistinguishable of the dead plants in the circle compared to outside.
Or you haven't done microscopical research on them, because he showed me pictures of it and it's quite interesting to see. So I would give, as I said, I would give an arm and a leg to see both of you in one room and discuss it and compare photos.
Yeah, you know, we had in 2019, I think 2019, we were at the same conference from the Schimper Foundation, where we both got a scholarship from the Schimper Foundation. And we had he was talking half an hour before me and I was talking half an hour after him. So we had this already. Another thing, yes, you may find these sand termites in the sand. We also saw them, you know, but correlation is not causation. That's the most important statement in science. Just, you know, the sand termite also correlates with sand. If you find them in the matrix in very high numbers, that was actually published by Fleer et al. 2015. They literally say the sand termite occurs in very high numbers in the matrix, and then you have it on the edge of the fairy circle. What does it mean? The sand termite correlates with sand, and then at certain locations you find them everywhere, but there are so many areas where you don't find them. And talk to Eugene Moraes, he will tell you exactly the same. Stephan.
I think it's loud enough. Huh? Okay, so my personal view on this is that I hope it will remain fairy circles forever, you know, and you will never crack it. Yeah, one discovery we made, which I find quite interesting, and if guests ask you about the fairy circles, you obviously tell them there's a lot of different hypotheses, but one discovery we made many moons ago when we built the Wolverans Dune Lodge, we had to dig 1,000 holes with a special shovel, and these holes are about 1.5 meters deep. And what was very interesting, even in, you know, the dry season in October, November, if you dug a hole in the matrix, as you say, the hole was dry. And if you dug the hole in the center of a circle, it became moist after about 1 meter depth. And that for me was always an indication that the water is actually collecting in the circle, which makes sense because in the dunes you have that, it's like a depression. And if it rains, obviously the water sort of centers in the fairy circle, and then that's where it goes down. So there's more water in the center of the circle, and then you have the grass on the circumference that take out that water. But for me, that very obvious unscientific observation by builders and non-scientists was an indication that it might have something to do with water harvesting, you know, that you somehow collect water that stays there for many months after the rainy season.
Yeah, exactly.
I just thought that was interesting to add.
Yeah,
because there is more moisture in the center of the circle than outside.
Yeah, that has been shown by many studies with soil moisture sensors up to 1 meter depth. So the moisture actually is particularly abundant at 50 centimeter depths and below. But that has been measured and shown in papers. Mike Picker, 2012, showed it. Many authors show that it's a moisture reservoir because there's nothing on top which transpires the water from it. It's like similar to think of a road effect. If you drive through the Marienfluss or Namib, best example, you see that on the edges of the tracks, the grasses are much higher because there's no competition from the car tracks, and so they get more water. And biomass equals water, water in these dry environments.
What
It's on, yeah, we hear you.
ago, but they found that inside of the circle, the sand grains were to nanomillimeter, the same, exactly the same size. Now, that could mean that if you have a glass jar and you put some golf balls inside,
What inside?
golf balls,
Off, okay. Yeah.
you know, then because of the same size, the gap between the golf balls is always the same. And any water which happens to come, maybe that is also a reason why inside it's, what Stephan said just now, why inside it is wet for longer. Because if you have marbles and golf balls and pebbles, then the difference in gaps actually facilitates that the water disperses and is used up more quickly. Have you come across that study? It must be about 20 years old, from the University of Pretoria.
Which author was it?
Oh, I don't know.
Hmm.
It was in some scientific magazine.
Hmm.
Yeah.
No, sorry. No, I'm not aware of this. What we did is sort of an indirect measurement. We did these with the mini disc infiltrometer. We measured the speed of water infiltration inside the Ferris circle and outside. And in these 10 regions, we found no systematic difference. What we found, and that's maybe quite interesting, at Namib, Marienfluss, and Kiribati area, which are all composed of these pure sands, the infiltration was very, very fast and pretty much equal in inside and outside. So I can only say that I personally don't think that particle size distributions can explain that the plants are wilting in the circle. But we measured it indirectly with the infiltrometer, but maybe one can have a closer look. Actually, my colleagues, Ravi et al. From the US, Sujit Ravi is an ecohydrologist. He looked, I think, at the particle size, and he said something in favor of what you mentioned. He found faster infiltration in the circle than outside. That was at Mirabel. But good point.
Sven Stender. I have a question. I doubt the whole thing. I see where you're coming from. You're coming from the patterns, and you have your mathematical model that sort of can model the whole thing. You're an eco-modelist. But the main assumption is to make this work actually is that the grasses on the circle or on the ring and in the matrix have so much power to suck the water out. That is what you're saying. No? That is why the plants in the circle, the grass plants, they die because they suck the water out, the other plants. According to scientists who are now challenging your publication, they say soil theory and soil evidence does not support this assumption. My question is a very simple one. If this circle grows, and there is evidence for growing circles, you see the strong grasses at the circle outside, outside the circle, the ring, you see them die. And then the weaker plants a little bit further outside, they get stronger. That totally doesn't make sense if the strong grasses who have the sucking power, and you said yourself, they are competing, they have a compatible advantage. It can't really happen. There's a contradiction.
What do you mean
What do you say?
What do you mean exactly based on what data?
There are growing circles. You see the strong grass at the circle, at the ring, they die. And then the grasses a little bit further out, they get stronger. How can the strong grasses die if they have this competitive advantage?
Yeah, maybe first of all, I'm not a modeler only. I did a lot of field work. So I know the field. And the second answer is, I know the new study, they question it on theory, what you mean, but they ignore what Mike Kramer found out. And Mike Kramer, he found out with stable isotope labeling of water, that water moves 7.5 meters in these Namib sand horizontally. These are facts, these are data, and no theory can question this. These are just established facts published in a peer-reviewed journal. And our data fully conform with this, that the strong decline in the circle was induced only when all the strong vegetation matrix was up. And they are sucking up the water from the circle because they are so strongly competing for the moisture. And your last point, it's actually very simple. Zelnick et al. Has shown in 2015 in the paper, with cumulative years of drier years, the fairy circuits enlarge in size. So he has analyzed a lot of satellite imagery, measured the diameter of the circle, and then correlated the diameter of the circle with water availability over a long sequence, I think of 12 years. And he showed that fairy circles not only more likely pop up after prolonged below average rainfall years, but also the size enlarges. So the strong plants, which you mean, they just die. And that's fair enough. If it's too dry, then even strong grasses will not survive and the circle will enlarge. At the same time, as I have shown, the circles are shrinking. And Zelnick has also shown it, the circles are shrinking after above average rainfall years, or they completely revegetate. So this is basically common knowledge. We know that it's published already 8 years ago. It's based on comparing a lot of satellite imagery. It's nothing special what you just mentioned. No. But what is the data basis for this claim? What is the data basis? What is the data basis for this claim?
How do you explain this phenomenon that the strong plants die, although they have all the competitive advantages, and the weaker plants outside, they get stronger? That doesn't make sense.
If it was below average rainfall sequence, and that has been documented in satellite imagery, it doesn't matter whether these are strong plants or weak plants. Even the strong plants will die because they are actually dormant. Like at Namib Run, the 2020 image I show, they are dormant and they are not alive at that stage. And if it's too dry, they will not reawake, but only the ones which are further away will become alive and get a living. So because the size of the fairy circle is an expression of the water shortage, the sites. And if it's below average rainfall, then the sites becomes larger. And that has been shown in empirical studies where they looked at satellite imagery and the respective rainfall years over a long sequence. And this is fully supporting the plant self-organization hypothesis, because all this is clearly driven by water. The sites of the circuits, the disappearance, the appearance of new circuits, and the enlargement of circuits is all driven by water, and the disappearance at the 150 millimeter rainfall ISO height is also driven by water. But the point is, I agree with you, but the point is, if we found so strong evidence rejecting the termite hypothesis, not the patterns, many people don't find termites, correlation cannot even explain causality. Then these grasses we excavated systematically. I've excavated with my colleagues more than 200 grasses, dead grasses in terry circuits in 4 regions. All our evidence shows that these grasses died completely independent of termite herbivory. That's why we published this title in October, because there is no proof for the termite hypothesis. And yeah, that's all what I can say.
Okay, my name is Shirley. Stephan, I've got a question more from a hydrological point of view. In those extremely arid areas, in hyper-arid areas as well, rainfall is extremely patchy, extremely variable, extremely low, and in both time and space, differs a lot. So have you sort of tried to link that very great variability, because you're talking about ISO hits, and those are just means over 90 years. There's a lot of variation within that.
Yeah.
Why are they in certain areas and not in others? Even along the ISO hits, you've got patches with fairy circles and patches without. So I wouldn't try to link it too closely to the ISO because they're extremely variable.
Yeah, no, that's a rough. I mean, at Gobabeb you have fairy circles and you have just 30 millimeter mean annual precipitation. So the actual range is pretty large, but you don't find them above 150. This is what we know. It goes down to 30 millimeters near Gobabeb. That's the driest part where fairy circuits exist. And of course, yes, it's very patchy, definitely. Was published by Joe Henschel and others, it's well known. But here we see at Namib Run, where we really have recorded the weather. We know the weather station from Kehrweder. We have a lot of rain gauges at Jakob directly. Here we can actually directly relate the amount of rainfall to the grass growth. So that's why it's one of the hotspots of fairy circle research.
We have one question from our chat. Did you see any differences in fairy circuit sizes and distributions? For example, are they smaller and closely spaced in wet end and larger in the dry end? You also answered a bit of this question, but
Yeah,
maybe you can give a more comments.
There is this assumption fairy circuits are larger in areas of Namibia where it's generally drier, like in the Hartmann's Valley. So west of the Hartmann's Mountains, you get huge fairy circuits, and it's very arid there. At Toktoki area, southern Namib Rand, where you have all the acacia trees and more moisture, obviously, the fairy circuits are tiny, just 2 to 3 meters in diameter. And 10 kilometers further north, at Jakob, they are 6-8 meters in diameter. So I think it's that the size is driven by moisture, not only climate, but also by the ability of soils and dunes to store water, store more water.
Thank you. Would you say that you speak of a certain intelligence of the plants? Would you say that other plants also have that intelligence, except the grasses?
Well, this is more, I put it in quotation marks.
Yes, me too.
Yeah, no, what you see here, these are so-called Turing patterns. If you want, you can Google a bit Alan Turing patterns. The pattern itself is intelligent, but the plants are actually having no other chance to grow in exactly this position. They have to do it because there's no other place to survive. And that's why you find these strong symmetrical geometries wherever you are in Australia, and I've shown a few examples. So the pattern is inherently intelligent, but the plants are not intelligent, but they do obviously very remarkable landscape scale patterns.
I'm asking this question because I know that Jürgens found fairy circles in the succulent Karoo, where the fairy circles are in areas where there is no grass and there is succulents. So did you see these fairy circles as well?
No, that's South Africa or?
In Namibia, southern Namibia.
Which area do you mean?
I believe it's around Luderitz or Kaokoveld Park.
No, I visited the Garup circuits, which is winter rainfall area already. That's the closest to Luderitz. I mean, at Luderitz, I don't know fairy circles. Yeah.
It could
it's
be
also, it's a definition. What is a fairy circle? Like the Angolian termite gaps are not fairy circles by definition. We also went to the southeastern Namibia, to the Kalahari, where you have the same rainfall, just 120, 130 millimeter, and you have Schmittia kalahariensis making gaps. That's north of Ariam's Flake. I talked to Eugene Marais, is that fairy circles or not? We couldn't agree actually on it because they lack a few properties that fairy circuits have. So just because somebody is claiming I saw fairy circuits here and there, Marion Meyer did the same. It doesn't have to be necessarily fairy circuits.
But there must be an explanation for these round circles.
I don't know them. I can really not talk about something which I have not seen.
Last question from the Zoom.
It's actually not a question. It's a comment from Michael Kramer. We heard his name before. And he said he thinks that the distribution is also closely linked to the occurrence of sandy soil.
Yeah. Sandy soil, yeah. Definitely. I mean, the majority of circuits you have in the Namib Sensi, and the more coarse the substrate, like on the gravel plains, Mirabeb, and this area, even at 80 millimeter rainfall, the less likely you have fairy circuits. Yeah, I agree.
Absolutely final.
Okay, if another final non-scientific observation. There's a certain area north of Jakob and Kwesigat when you fly to Geluk, where you have rocky slopes from petrified dunes and then rocky slopes. And there's a lot of perfectly patterned fairy circles there, which always puzzled or diluted that idea of water capturing, because the water there doesn't settle. It runs off the mountain and you have the circle. So it's not only in sandy soils, but also in gravel and rocky areas.
You must take me there and show me.
You must just fly around a bit and don't drive 50,000 kilometers a year.
I come to Namib Rand in a few days.
Thank you very much for all this information here. I agree, let the fairy circles remain fairy circles. Let the mystique around it stay, odd. And let us all have all the theories and explore these theories. Thank you very much. I forgot to hand over the list. So before you leave, please fill your name into the list. If we have your email already, if you are a member, you do not need to enter your email address again. This is mainly for those that aren't members yet and would like to become members. We can always use more. And now I invite you for a drink and some more discussions without a microphone.
Thanks.